Hey everybody, and welcome to Chapter 8. Chapter 8, we are talking about quasi-experimental designs. So this chapter, I will warn you, is a little bit short. Compared to the other chapters this semester, in terms of like textbook, it's definitely one of the shortest chapters. But the next chapter, Chapter 9, is factorial designs. And factorial designs are kind of tricky, and that chapter is a little bit longer, so that's going to be kind of a hard chapter. So if you get done with this one a little bit early because it is brief, maybe get started on, take a peek at Chapter 9. Alright, so let's get into it. This chapter we're going to be talking about quasi-experimental variables, quasi-experimental designs, yeah, it's kind of like a mix. I don't want to, don't write this down, but it's kind of like a mix between a correlational study and an experimental design. So I'll explain a little bit about that in just a second. So what we're going to be looking at this chapter is what they are, some examples of what quasi-experimental designs are, and some possible confounds that you might experience along the way. If you get a little bit bored of hearing my voice, there is another video that's only about 2 minutes long, but gives a very quick kind of explainer for this. I wanted to give you that resource in case you wanted it. Alright, so what is quasi? What is a quasi-experiment? So the prefix quasi, what does it mean? Basically, it means apparently. So quasi-experimental means almost or kind of experimental, but not really experimental. So it looks like an experiment, it tastes like an experiment, it smells like an experiment, but there's one really big difference here, and that's that the independent variable is not manipulated. So in other words, it's kind of like you can have a study that has multiple groups, but you are not randomly assigning those multiple groups, and that is the key. So in a true experiment, you're able to randomly assign folks to one group or the other, or to one condition or the other. In a quasi-experimental design, you can't do that. So you might still have groups, but you're just not able to randomly assign people to those groups. And I'm going to give you some examples of that in this chapter. But that's just what I just told you in that last 30 seconds. That's the entire chapter. That we can create experimental designs where you can't randomly assign people to groups, but you can still draw some meaning from the conclusions that you find there. So the independent variable is not manipulated. So if you were to take this class with Dr. Eric Bressler in our department, he really doesn't like quasi-experimental designs, and I think he doesn't like the name quasi-experiment because when we talk about an experimental design, we talked about an experimental design as like, hey, you have to have a variable that you can manipulate, that you can form groups or conditions by. That's what makes it an experiment. And this design is saying, yeah, but here's an experimental design if you can't do that. If you can't do the thing that this whole concept is defined on. That's why he doesn't like the name quasi-experiment. But that's what we're looking at here. That's whenever we have an independent variable that can't really be manipulated by you, the researcher, and is usually decided by some other factor before you get to it. So those groups are formed, but maybe not at random. So, hey, Professor Daniel, can you give me an experiment? Yes, I'd be glad to. So if I were to do like, if I were to test, let's say, how spicy people report a collection of hot sauces to be. And I'm going to group this between people that have depression and people who don't have depression. That is a quasi-experiment. I'm going to have two groups that are defined, and they are going to do something. They're going to report how spicy that hot sauce is, but I'm not able to randomly assign people into those groups. I can't say, all right, half of you, you're going to be depressed for the next 6 months. The other half of you, you're not going to be depressed for the next 6 months. I can't do that physically, and even if I could, it wouldn't be ethical. So that is an example of a quasi-experiment, where we have groups that are formed, that are defined by some way that I'm listing, but that I can't actually put people into those groups. They're already defined for me. Sometimes you'll hear this called one-group designs. So there are two kind of specific variations that we're going to be looking at here, and that's going to be the kind of single group or the one group versus the non-equivalent groups. And whenever you look in your textbook on this, that's basically the two that your book gives. And they're, like that there's one section about the single group and there's one section about the non-equivalent groups. And it's going to talk about pre-tests and post-tests and stuff like that, but really it's all the same thing for either variation of this. So the first example that I want to give you is cosmetic surgery. So the question is, does cosmetic surgery make people happier? And this is, on the face of it, a very important question, because people spend a lot of money on cosmetic surgery, even though I feel like we've all kind of trained ourselves to say, hey, cosmetic surgery, you know, it's I don't know, like, people are like, it's elective, it's optional, and therefore it's frivolous. But other folks will say, well, it's not really anybody's business who gets cosmetic surgery. So anyways, the question isn't about whether or not it's important or not. The question is, does it make people happier? That's an important question. So it's a good question because a lot of people use cosmetic surgery. It costs people a lot of money, and we want to know whether or not it's worth it. Does it result in any kind of mental health outcomes or life outcomes? Here's the issue, though. Even though this is a really good question, we can't give people cosmetic surgery, right? I can't say, all right, half the class, you're going to get a Brazilian butt lift, and the other half of this class, you're not going to get a Brazilian butt lift. I can't do that ethically, right? Like, I would not be able to do that legally. So we have to find other ways to evaluate this question without forming those kinds of groups, without me randomly assigning people to those groups. So there was a study that actually tried to look at this, but we're not going to be able to make this as an actual experiment for the reasons that I talked about. I can't randomly assign people. So we have to think about how are these groups being decided. So we know one of these groups, and this is I'm going to tell you a little bit about this this article right here from 2013, the Margraf article. But what they basically did is, like, they said, all right, we want to look at cosmetic surgery and whether or not it makes people happier afterwards, and whatever. So we have one group, and that's the people that go through and they get the surgery. So what would be a good control group? What would be a good comparison group with that? What they came down, because you can't just say, 15 random people that you find off the street. And the reason why you can't is because, well, maybe those people don't want cosmetic surgery, right? And so then you're comparing two totally separate groups. One group that wants cosmetic surgery and got it, and one that does not want it and did not get it. So then how do you know that maybe the people, if there's happiness differences in either group, how can you be sure that it's because of the surgery and not because of the desire to want a surgery? Does that make sense? I really hope so. If it doesn't, shake your head. If you have your webcam on, I'll know, and I'll email. You know that I'm just joking about that. I can't actually email you if you're shaking your head in front of the webcam right now. But let me know if that doesn't make sense. So basically what they did here is they had two groups. One group, which, got the cosmetic surgery, and then the other group expressed that they were interested in cosmetic surgery. They set up an appointment at a plastic surgery office, but then they canceled it. And those were the participants of the second group. They are going to be the control group because they had the desire to have cosmetic surgery but didn't actually get the surgery. So that is the difference between those groups. And so and actually to me this is really interesting, and I want to unpack this, but I want to unpack the results first and then talk about these groups. So what you're looking at here, the green group, this is the group that got the surgery, and this is the group that scheduled the surgery but didn't go through with it. And so you're looking at two different dependent variables. You're looking at their self-esteem scores, and you're looking at their life satisfaction ratings. And this is, to me, really interesting because what we see here is that folks that have the surgery, that generally speaking, they report having higher life satisfaction, but they also seem to, within a year, report higher self-esteem as well. The comparison group, the group that wanted the surgery but didn't ultimately get it, you can see they're a little bit less in terms of their life satisfaction and ultimately in their self-esteem. The only real difference here is right during the date of that proposed surgery, there is no difference in their self-esteem scores, but those differences manifest over time in just a couple of months. By month number 3, you can see there's a difference here in how people feel about themselves before and after their cosmetic surgery. So this was a longitudinal design, and this kind of complex dynamic that we're talking about here, that's called an interaction. We're going to talk a lot about that next chapter, about what an interaction means. But basically it means that the behavior changed between groups over time. So here there was no difference, and then here there was a difference. All right, so that is and so the reason why it's a longitudinal design is because we're tracking people over time, right? From now to 1 year later, and we're checking in with those same people, so that makes it longitudinal. So this is a quasi-experimental design. Just to reiterate, why is it quasi-experimental? Because we weren't able to decide who was in each group. We were able to define that after the fact, but I wasn't able to go in and say, all right, those of you who are getting cosmetic surgery, those of you who wanted cosmetic surgery, we're going to deny you that, because that wouldn't be ethical. All right, so that was, so this would be basically a pre-test and a post-test design, because they have the pre-test here before the surgery, and then they're going to have it afterwards. And actually, I take that back. I don't remember in this article if this is specifically before or after the baseline rating. I think it actually might be after the, right after the surgery. I could be wrong about that. So it's set up kind of like a pre-test, post-test design, because they're looking at the after effects of the behavior. So that is one kind of design. The other kind of design is sometimes called an interrupted time design. And a lot of people will call this, as you'll see, called an A-B design. An A-B design is basically saying, like, we're going to have condition A, and then we're going to have condition B. So if you are taking learning with Dr. Reyes or Dr. Andrade in our psych department, you're going to come across A-B designs and ABA designs a lot, or ABC designs, and those are all referring to this idea of an interrupted time design. So it's kind of like a repeated measures design, or a within subjects design that we talked about a couple of chapters ago. And this is where all the participants are going to get multiple levels of this independent variable. So they're going to go through, and then we're going to give them another condition, and then we might give them another condition, or we might return them back to the first condition. So all participants are going to get all levels of the independent variable. It's just that the independent variable might not be manipulated directly by the researchers. So you're going to see this used a lot in what they call policy studies. If you take political science or even sociology, where you look at behavior or trends before and after certain legislation is passed, to look at whether or not that legislation was effective, or if it had any consequences or side effects. Here is one of my favorite examples of this, because it's really kind of scary to think about, and that is looking at time schedules or times during the day versus parole hearings. Obviously, this is an important question, because, and some of you are criminal justice minors, and so you're going to be thinking about some of these ideas. So legal decisions are subjective, right? Because legal decisions have to be argued by people, and people can be persuasive or less persuasive, and so legal judgments are that. They are judgments. They are not made objectively, even though we would like to think that they were objective. We would like to think that any kind of legal decision is going to not have any kind of bias or any kind of confounding variable or anything else that might be influencing the results of that decision. But that's not always the case. There's some researchers that were interested in looking at parole hearings, so looking at whether or not people could leave prison and reintegrate into society, and they looked at how often people were given parole over the span of a day. Because these researchers suspected that maybe some people, like in the morning, maybe judges are really grumpy, and for that reason they're not going to extend parole, but maybe for people at the end of the day, when judges are ready to go home, maybe they're more likely to give paroles, right? That's an interesting question. We can test that out. So these researchers created a quasi-experiment, and the reason why they had to do this interrupted time design like this is because they couldn't say, like, all right, well, we think that judges are making parole decisions based on the time of day, so we think that if it's in the morning that people are going to be denied that. So what we want to do is we want to have these judges come in and just for the next month only give verdicts in the morning, and then the next month only give them in the afternoon. That would be unethical, right? Because if you think that that is if that's changing the data, then you're kind of assuming that it's going to cost some people their parole, right? So if you suspect that it makes a difference, sometimes you have to go with these quasi-experimental designs because it's more ethical that way. So basically they use interrupted time design by watching what happened during the day and recording it. And what you're going to see here is that they found that food actually made a difference here. So what you're looking at here is the effects of food breaks. So they had 2 different food breaks in the middle of their day. So these judges come in at the very beginning of the day, then they get brunch, and then they get like a little afternoon snack afterwards. I believe this was in Israel where this study took place. So I don't know if they have traditional lunch breaks like we do in America, or if they have a slightly different kind of schedule where they have brunch and then post-brunch or something like that. Kind of like Spain does, right? Where they have like a siesta. That's what you're looking at right here is time goes by. So let's say this is 8 a.m. over here, and then down here we got, I don't know, 5 p.m. or something like that. And so you can see the proportion of favorable decisions. We got a lot of favorable decisions happening when the judges just first come in. And then as time goes on, it really, really drops, right? And then once they have some food, it jumps back up where we have favorable decisions again. And then it drops, and then it goes back up, and then it drops at the end of the day, right? So this is really kind of scary because this is showing, at least for this region, that these judges were making decisions based on how hungry they were or how hangry they were, right? That basically whenever they came in, that as it got closer to break or closer for time to leave, they started having less favorable decisions, and they started denying these folks parole. Now, are there some confounds? Sure. Let's say if we only did this for one day, maybe it's just by chance, right? Maybe just the way that it was scheduled, where we had the people who had really good behavior, early in the day and then early after lunch. Maybe that was the case. So there could be some confounds that deal with this, but that's why you would want to replicate it and try it in other contexts, in other regions, and things like that. So, does this show that food matters when it comes to parole decisions? Sure. How confident are you of that? I don't know, because we're not able to actually directly manipulate the independent variable here. Maybe the next thing to do is then have so again, you can't tell some judges, all right, we want you to not have any food breaks, because if you are looking at this and that means that you're going to be prepared to have the parole thing sink down to this maybe, right? Where you have a bunch of people deny parole and have to spend extra years in prison they might not have had if their judge had a food break, right? All right, so let's move on. So one of the final things that I want to talk about is threats to internal validity in quasi-experimental designs. The textbook mentions this, and I just want to highlight this idea that quasi-experiments are good at assessing 3 of the big kind of criteria for causality in experiments. In research, because experiments can do all 3, right? You may remember experiments can demonstrate covariance, so they can demonstrate a relationship. They can determine directionality, and they can I had a brain fart. The third one is that they can assess internal validity. That you are measuring what in fact you think that you are measuring. Now the textbook says that quasi-experiments are good at 2 of those, which is the first 2, covariance and directionality, and maybe not so good at internal validity. That internal validity is kind of where its weaknesses are. There's more room for confounds than there are in experiments. So it's harder to assess cause and effect or causality because of that. Because we can't manipulate the independent variable, that means that there are other confounding variables that might be attributing to our effects that we are not directly measuring. So some of the examples here, one is a selection effect. And the selection effect is that there could be pre-existing differences in your participants that you're not able to know because you didn't randomly assign people to those conditions or those groups. The example of the cosmetic surgery comes to mind because you remember I talked about how we can't just pick random people, right? Where you have people who wanted to get cosmetic surgery and then went and got it, and then people who didn't want it because they're randomly chosen and didn't have cosmetic surgery. So the people that said they had higher self-esteem afterwards, right? If we just pick random people for our control group, we wouldn't be able to say, oh, actually it could be because the people who wanted cosmetic surgery already felt better about themselves. Maybe they already had higher self-esteem. I don't know. To me, that doesn't actually make a whole lot of sense, but I don't know, right? So selection effects might contribute to the data. We can't really rule them out because we weren't directly assigning and randomly assigning people to those groups. There can be other design confounds, like you might have like a maturation threat, and so that would be like a maturation effect would be like where people naturally change from the pre-test to the post-test. So if we are talking about people who, you know, like we were looking at the cosmetic surgery, and we're looking at people like right after they got it versus later on, you know, down the line, like a year later. And we saw how like that one of those groups kind of flattened out, right? That there wasn't this interaction where initially there was no differences and then ultimately there turned out to be differences. We can't guarantee that that wasn't because of maturation, that wasn't because of so maybe, for example, that was a really stressful time right after the surgery was scheduled, and so there were no differences between those groups. And then after time, just naturally, that people went back to their baseline rates, and maybe that is the effects that we were seeing. That is an example of maturation, where behavior naturally changes over the course of time. History threats might be how, or history confound, could be how a real-world event changed behavior. So, for example, let's say if we were talking about, I'm gonna keep on with cosmetic surgeries because I want to be consistent here. But like, let's say. This is actually kind of hard now that I think about it. But let's say that somebody got cosmetic surgery to cover up crow's feet on their eyes or something like that. And then 6 months later, there was this movie that came out and it had a really cool action star, and she was a little bit older, and so she had crow's feet too, and now crow's feet were in. Now crow's feet are fashionable. Those people that got cosmetic surgery for their crow's feet might be feeling a little bit differently about their surgery now, right? That's an example of a history confound because we're looking at a real-world change that happened that might affect behavior. So you might see this with legislation too, right? You might see it for general trends in the culture that might happen. You can see it at a college level when we talk about things like how people are more stressed out in the middle of the semester and at the very end of the semester, and people are generally less stressed out at the beginning of the semester. And that's because of those exams that they experience throughout the semester have an effect on behavior and how people feel. That is an example of a history confound. All right, so that went a little bit longer than I thought that it would, but that's because I tried to give you a lot of examples. Now that we are at the end of this video, I'm going to go fetch a dog and show you the dog because you were so nice, an audience. So let me pause this and I'll be right back. Oh, it's recording. Okay, and so, whoop. Wait, I don't know if you can see this. This is my dog Hopper. You've met Hopper before. He was sleeping. He's not the biggest fan of me right now because I gave him a BATH a couple of days ago, and it's because he rolled around in something disgusting he found in the yard. And he knew he was in trouble when he came in and he had to get a bath, and he did not like that. Oh, he heard me say that, and now he wants to leave. You can see my other dog down here. You can see Fozzie. He's hanging out. Fozzie is my he's my ride or die puppy. Foz is this is the man. This is the dude. He's a little bit of I don't know. We joke that he's like the world's best pet cow because he just kind of doesn't do anything. He's very, very lazy and sleepy, but very nice and very happy about it. He just does not have I don't know. He was very energetic whenever he was a kid, and now he's just kind of super loyal shadow who likes to follow me around. All right, is that good enough? Is there anything else that I can do to reward you for hanging on to the end? I don't know. If you can think of any kind of reward that I can put at the end of these videos, let me know, and I will see about putting that at the end. All right. So, maybe extra credit or something like that for the next video. We'll see. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you later.